I want to respond to this comment that was left in one of my videos, and I'm going to debunk it by showing this article showing how women, even in ancient Roman days, exercised dominance, right? Now, this video was non-thinking ape copes as he frames women's hatred of men as greed, right? He's making excuses. Now, Danielle says, no, you have this wrong. It's not simply that women hate men, it's a bourgeois ideology, right? First wave feminism was clearly very bourgeoisie. Well, Dan, women are the gender bourgeoisie. So female nature is bourgeoisie. Second and third wave feminism has more of a middle class character. Now, Dan, you just contradicted yourself. If it was a bourgeoisie ideology, then middle class women couldn't adopt it. But because in general, ruling ideas come from the ruling class. Thanks for admitting that. So women are the ruling class, whether they're, you know, uh, middle class, upper class, or lower class. Otherwise, why didn't feminism happen 300 years before it did? Well, Dan, it did. It did well before it because feminism is just an expression of female nature, right? Why did it start in UK? It didn't. Rome is in Italy, the most advanced capitalist country at the time. No, well, here's the most advanced country at its time. Rome reached 1 million people, citizens at one time. You will probably wouldn't see that in Europe again until the 18th century, right? It places moral blame on men for the problems of capitalism and contains gendered class prejudice against poor working class men. And yes, it's also bourgeoisie middle class women wanting what bourgeois middle class men have. Okay, now I'm going to debunk this. Now, this young lady, how a protest by Roman women helped change an ancient law. They didn't help change a law. They got rid of a law that placed limitations on their behavior. They didn't work for their husbands, by the way, and you'll see this. The women of ancient Rome took to the streets to protest in 195 BC. See that this is BC. So feminism and women's nature comes way before the 1700s. It was a striking manifestation of their power and was rigidly patriarchal society. If they have power, then it wasn't patriarchal. That's why we have to ditch the term patriarch. It's a lie. It's a lie that insults us men, right? The event was the Senate's discussion on the repeal of Lex Oppia, a wartime austerity measure implemented in the height of the Second Punic War in 215 BC. A series of laws were implemented in this period of financial crisis, including those which saw the doubling and tripling of taxes, trust funds borrowed for use by the state and the citizens' private property diverted to public use. Now, the Lex Oppia was implemented to severely curb female expenditure on adornment and finery, not food and lodging. All their needs were still being met. So this is just them showing off their status. This law restricted how much gold a woman were allowed to wear and what they wore, sorry. They were no longer permitted to dress in multicolored garments, particularly purple. Why purple? Because purple was extremely expensive and was something that was a color, that is, that was particularly worn by the royalty. So women would wear purple to say, I, as a woman, am royalty. They were also no longer allowed to ride their carriages within 1 mile of the city. Why is that? Well, like I said, Rome reached 1 million citizens at one time. Can you imagine the congestion? So basically, they said you had to stop your carriages, get out and walk. There's not enough space for them. Now, why would women be fighting for that? Right? Because they want to show up in their carriages and say, look how much wealth I have. I got my own carriage. I'm being ridden around. Right? They were also no longer allowed. Oh, yeah. These restrictions prevented what women saw as their right to be elegant in appearance. See, this is not a right. This is a privilege. It's a privilege to be able to show off your self-importance. It's not a right. More importantly, at the time, when women did not enter into the service of the state and rarely into business, yet they didn't have to work for a living. That's another privilege. That shows you that these women were the upper crust. These continuing restrictions denied Roman women the opportunity to proclaim their status and identity through the only avenue open to them, personal adornment. Now, this disgusting feminist tried to make this as a drawback, but these women didn't want a personal identity through being a senator or something like that, because that's work. Even high status men like senators, they had to show up at the Senate. They had to deal with boring talks. They had to worry about blowback against any bad decisions they made. So these women didn't want those. And the fact that they got this law change taken off shows you that they have plenty of power. And if they wanted to enter these fields, they could have, just like today. The language of adornment and its symbols were potent and played a key role in differentiating the status of individuals. There you go. These women wanted to show off their status, their self-importance. This is a privilege, not a right. Adornment could be seen as a weapon of choice for women who sought by some means to empower themselves. They already were empowered. They were housewives leeching off their husbands. In society where women remain dependent and under the control of their fathers and husbands, that's a lie. If they were under the control of their fathers and husbands, again, they wouldn't be able to change anything. She possessed no assets of her own. Nonsense. All the men's property belonged to her, one way or the other. Right? Property and money received as gifts or inheritance by a single woman remained under the control of her father, and as a married woman were absorbed into her husband's estate. Yeah, because he had to control things. Well, he didn't have to control things, he had to look after things. He was responsible. So, of course, men's responsibility, which is a labor for men, is being shown as a control, right? Women, however, could gain a measure of control. They always had control. This is a bullshit, right? I'm going to bypass that. Unlike other wartime measures, the restrictions enforced by Lex Oppia remained in place for the gals, right? Because it wasn't necessary. They were fighting for a privilege. The views of conservative Roman patriarchy may have been that of austerity enforced on females by this particular law was equally desirable during peacetime. Right. Why? Because the women were wasting money on luxuries. They're wasting money on luxuries. The Roman woman believed that in 20 years on, in this time of peace and prosperity, it was unacceptable that this law was still enforced. What I say? What did I say, Dan? Female nature is that when times are tough, she puts a mask on and she pretends to submit to her husband. She doesn't want to rock the boat. As soon as peace comes along, they want everything. The mask comes off, right? The Lex Oppia and the question of its repeal was politically and socially complex issue. No, it wasn't complex. It wasn't complex at all. It was a very simple rule to prevent a single action of women wasting money, of showing off their wealth. The events that it set in motion in the streets of Rome created a precedent which saw Roman women stand up for their rights and make their own voices heard. How could they do that? You just claim that women were owned by their husbands and everything they owned was owned by their husbands, right? Remember, liars will always contradict themselves. Those in the Senate who proposed the repeal of the law raised the question. If an emergency measure passed during wartime should forever be observed, then why have we repaid loans advanced by private citizens? Because those private citizens were men. And those private loans were necessary. They weren't wasteful money, right? They weren't women wasting wealth of their husbands. These men earn that money. It belongs to them. The answer being that all Roman men have benefited from the relaxation of these emergency measures. So look what she's trying to compare. She's trying to compare Roman men getting back what they put in to women not being allowed to waste money. Unlike men, the Senate was reminded women have no offices, spoils of wars, triumphs, or decorations available to them. Nonsense. Their husband's spoils of war are the women's spoils of war. Only the husband had to put his life down on to get those spoils. The woman just leached off the husband, right? Their badges of honor were elegance and adornment. Yeah, but they don't have any honor. They haven't done anything to earn honor. It is not reasonable to consider, too, that for those who sought to evoke this law were other agendas at play. Richly adorned women were status markers for their husbands. Bullshit. Bullshit. These women parading their wealth were showing their status, not their husbands. You thinking when the husband's at work and the woman's riding her carriage in the congested streets of Rome, showing off her clothes, it's for him? No, that's bullshit. It's like women claim when they wear high heels or makeup, they blame us guys, right? This feminist scumbag, of course, is blaming the men of Rome, right? Would you, in your refusal to revoke this law, the question was put to the Senate, allowing the trappings of your own horse to be more splendid than the dress of your wife? Well, when the horse is dressed up, the wife gets to use the horse, doesn't she? Right? So it's not the same thing. And again, these wives aren't owned by their husbands. The husbands are owned by their wives, right? Opposition to the repeal of the Lex Oppia initiated several lines of defense. Really, why would they need lines of defense? Why would they just say no? Cato the Elder. Now, Cato the Elder is no different than the trad men of today who give lip service to holding women back, but in the end cave in. He lamented the Romans' husbands lost control of their wives. How could they lose control since they were never in control, Cato? Right? He warned them that once the law had ceased to set a limit to the wives' expenditures, they would never be able to set such limits themselves. A woman could afford to purchase luxuries from her own purse. Really, her own purse? I thought men owned everything. It was warned would do so. The woman who could not, would beg her poor wretch of a husband until he submitted to her will. So how is this a patriarchy if a woman could nag a man into submission? The men are the submissive ones. The husband works to provide for the wife, and she tells him what to do. So this is not a patriarchy. This is a matriarchy. And notice again, Dan, that the poor women were just as bad as the wealthy women, right? So this is, if it's bourgeoisie again, it's the gender bourgeoisie. All women are above men, right? The prospect of refusal of the repeal generated the most striking manifestation of women's power. Again, this woman just contradicted herself. How could women have power in a patriarchy where men owned everything and including their wives, right? Women's anger led to an outpouring of disapproval from the towns and rural areas. Rural areas too, right? Doesn't matter where you live or what class you are. Women are the same. They streamed into the center of Rome to make their outrage felt. Why would they do that since they had no power and they didn't believe they could make a change? They crowd into the city in huge numbers. Really? How could they do that? Like, who's looking after their children? Who's taking care of home? Don't they have jobs? The answer is they don't have jobs. Housewife isn't a job, obviously. Venting their fury and blocking the streets and the approaches to the forum. I wonder what happened to all those tough Roman soldiers that were out warring and killing all the Celts, right? All of a sudden, they're nowhere to be found. Described in the Senate by the opposition as uncontrollable and untamed creatures. Well, you can't control your betters, right? And of course, they're untamed. They're in charge. They can do whatever they want. The anger of those women emboldened them. Cato called the event an insurrection of women, of panic-stricken matrons. See, Cato is a scum, is a tradcon scum. They're not panic-stricken. They're angry. And they're effective, Cato, you loser. If they were just panic-stricken, they wouldn't get what they wanted. On the streets and the street corners, they did the unspeakable. They approached and urged men, councils, and officials for their support and votes. Yeah, they exercised protest. That's right. And it worked. The growing mass of women filling the forum applied sufficient pressure to cause the opposition to attempt to strike fear into the Senate. Why would a bunch of patriarchs fear women? The failure to defeat this proposed repeal, it was warned, would result in a success for these women, which would see them interfere with other legislation. How could they interfere if they were too busy working away at home, right? Might they also, the opposition threatened, review all the laws set by our forefathers, which made our women subject to their husbands? Consider, too, what might be the situation should the law be revoked. Well, dude, women aren't subjects of their husbands, obviously, right? If presently with all these bonds, you can still scarcely control them. Well, you don't have any bonds on them because if you had any bonds on them, they would be under control. So, Dan, you see that women never were always on top. They were always on top. You know, in societies where it was war torn and impoverished, women were still on top. They were just wearing a mask, Dan, right? Speeches were delivered for and against the bill. Gee, why would it be for and against? Wouldn't the Senate just say no to these women that they supposedly own and control, right? But the protesting women would not allow their voices to be silenced. After the speeches and pressure on the streets was intensified by the demonstration to such a point that the threat of veto was removed. In 19, or sorry, I want to say 19, in 195 BC, 20 years after the emergency measure had been passed, the Lex Oppia was successfully revoked. So, do you understand now that women always, always, always had power over men any time in history, any culture, any country, worldwide? If you're a housewife and the man has to fill all the roles, whether it's senator or street cleaner, they're working for the girls and the girls are in charge. And of course, guys, what angered the most is Cato, of course, because he shows you just how feckless men are. These patriarchs are. As soon as the women demand, the men give in because the women are in charge and they own everything. Just because a property is put in a man's name doesn't mean his wife doesn't own the property. She owns it because she owns him. And that's my answer to you, Daniel.